Okay, it's been a little while since we've talked about the Book of Judges. Roughly like 9 months? Jeez, I could have had a kid in that time. Sorry, that's my bad. But we're back at it now, so it's all good. If anyone needs a refresher, we last left off with Abimelech, who destroyed his family's legacy by declaring himself king, and in doing so, he became the poster child of how to be a bad king. Next up on my list of stories to cover is Jephthah. We're going to talk about his life, and specifically what happened to his daughter. To find out, we first need to learn about who Jephthah was, and why his story is even included in the Book of Judges. Jephthah was a man who single-handedly turned his greatest victory into the worst tragedy of his life. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi. You'll find the links below. Thank you. By the way, if you're following along, you may have noticed I've skipped over some minor judges, but don't worry, they will get their deserved attention soon. I just want to focus entirely on Jephthah for this episode. Now, the story of Jephthah begins like all stories in the Book of Judges. Israel was turning away from Yahweh to worship foreign gods. If you're wondering why Israel doesn't seem to get it after the 6th judge, it's because each judge rules for at least a generation. As older generations grow and pass away, the younger people who didn't live through the previous oppression start turning away from Yahweh. Because they turn away, he sends a new nation to conquer the Israelites. From our perspective, it plays out every few pages, and we wonder, what do the Israelites not understand? But in their perspective in the story, it happens over the course of generations. So anyway, if you're wondering what Israel does not understand, that's why. It's the cycle of history itself happening before our eyes, just in a few pages. Anyway, back to the story. Yahweh sent the Ammonites to conquer Israel, and they ruled Israel for 18 years. As usual, the Israelites begged Yahweh to help them, but because he's done this rodeo several times before, Yahweh got sassy and said something like, "I saved you from the Egyptians, the Moabites, the Canaanites, and even more, but you still turn away to other gods. Why are you not going to those other gods you've chosen now?" Which is a fair critique, honestly, and the Israelites must have noticed this too, because they got rid of all their foreign idols and deities in their land. And at this point, Yahweh would send someone to save his people. However, right after getting rid of all their foreign idols, they don't wait for Yahweh to send someone, and instead, they seek someone out on their own accord, and the man they find is a man named Jephthah. Jephthah was the son of a man named Gilead, born to a prostitute mother. Gilead was also the name of the city which they lived in, which has led some to theorize that Jephthah's father may be unknown, as a way of saying any man in Gilead could be his father. This theory doesn't hold much validity when you learn that Jephthah had multiple brothers, and all those brothers drove him out of town so that he would not be a threat to them receiving their inheritance. You may be wondering, wait, isn't Jephthah the son of a man and a prostitute, thus born out of wedlock, and he can't receive any inheritance? That is true, but it is still possible that Gilead could have given things to Jephthah at the end of his life. The brothers removing Jephthah was a way of stopping that from ever becoming a problem. Jephthah fled the city of Gilead and wound up in the land of Tob, roughly modern-day Jordan. In Tob, he teamed up with some raiders and became a skilled warrior, quickly working through the ranks to become one of their leaders. It was by leading raids that Jephthah's skills became noteworthy to the Israelites, and the leader of Gilead specifically went to Tob to recruit Jephthah. Jephthah is surprised by the leaders of Gilead coming to recruit him. He thought the men of Gilead hated him, and the men of Gilead did. But they hated their oppressors even more, so this was an enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. Jephthah agreed to help the men of Gilead on the condition that he would be made their leader, and they agreed. The first thing Jephthah did when he returned to his home was write a letter to the king of the Ammonites asking why they were invading and conquering. The Ammonite king said that the Israelites stole the land that they were currently inhabiting. Jephthah then responded with a large letter explaining the history of Israel and how the land the Israelites currently live on was Amorite land, not Ammonite land. Therefore, they had no reason to invade. Yes, their names are really Amorite and Ammonite. Very minute difference, but it's an easy mistake to make. Jephthah also added a line saying that Israel had already inhabited the lands for 300 years by this point, so why is it a problem now all of a sudden? This specific line is very interesting in the context of Judges, because it doesn't really seem correct. We've seen the Israelites getting invaded by several different foreign powers now. So much so that it's to a point where they need to get saved from conquerors every generation or so. I'd argue that people definitely have a problem with the Israelites living on that land at this point in the story, and they have had that problem for a long time now. However, the reason I single this line out is because we need to remember, this story did not originally exist in the greater context of Judges. It, like several other stories, was likely its own independent story before being codified in the Hebrew Bible in the narrative of Judges. And this line reinforces that idea. Jephthah would not have suggested that no one had a problem with the Israelites occupying that land for centuries if the story originated within the greater context of Judges. It had to come from its own separate tradition. If you're watching the Judges series back to back and it feels like I'm repeating myself, I sort of am, but I am also trying to emphasize something. I'm emphasizing that Judges was multiple independent stories, and I want to remind everyone of that whenever we find an instance in the text that supports this idea. These aren't just summary videos, I want to teach them history too. But anyway, back to the story. The Ammonite king ignored Jephthah's message and mobilized his army to invade the Israelites. It was at that point the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he used that blessing to lead the Israelites' army against the Ammonites. But here's another interesting quirk that makes this story different. Jephthah wasn't sent by Yahweh. The people of Israel chose Jephthah on their own, and Yahweh does not indicate any approval or disapproval until Jephthah's already leading the army. This is a sign of Yahweh becoming more distant to the Israelites, and as the book of Judges goes on, we'll see him become more and more distant. Before the battle, Jephthah made a vow to Yahweh, saying that if the Lord granted him victory, he would sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his door when he arrives home from battle. Jephthah and his army charged into battle and obliterated the Ammonite army. Jephthah and the Israelites also pillaged a ton of surrounding towns to celebrate their victory before returning home. When Jephthah finally returned home, the first thing that ran out the door to greet him was his daughter. Jephthah was overjoyed to see her at first, before remembering the vow he made. Jephthah told his daughter about the vow, how he needed to sacrifice whatever came out his door first to greet him, and she accepted her fate. But she asked for 2 more months of life so she could mourn her virginity and her youth. Jephthah permitted this, and after those 2 months, the text says Jephthah did as he vowed, and it is implied he sacrificed his daughter. And this is where the scholarly debate comes into play. Everyone asks the same central question. Did Jephthah offer his daughter to Yahweh as a human sacrifice? There are arguments for and against. I'll do my best to present both sides, so we can figure out what was most likely implied by the line, Jephthah did as he vowed. The more popular crowd, as far as I can tell, is yes, Jephthah did indeed offer his daughter as a human sacrifice to Yahweh, and their primary reasoning is that that's what it says in the text. The main reason the no crowd has, and the reason why there's any debate of this at all, is what happens in the book of Samuel. In the book of Samuel, Samuel's mother Hannah sacrifices her son to God, and he becomes a prophet. Basically, the no crowd, no, Jephthah did not offer his daughter as a human sacrifice, but instead circumvented it. They argued that Jephthah could have done something similar here, and that Jephthah offered his daughter as a prophetess to Yahweh. And in fairness, that's not completely unreasonable. Just a few chapters earlier, we saw a woman prophet in the form of Deborah. Not only was she a spiritual leader, but she led armies and is often listed as a judge of Israel, sometimes without Barak. Is it really that odd to think that another woman could be made a prophet when we already have one in the book of Judges? And women as spiritual leaders wasn't an unheard of thing for the Hebrew people. It was rare for sure, but there are a few instances of it in history. Jerusalem was the center of Yahweh worship, but it was not the only place where Yahweh was worshipped. There were a community of Yahweh worshippers across the ancient Near East, stretching all the way down the Arabian Peninsula, where people worshipped the God of the Israelites, Yahweh, even though they were not Israelites themselves. One community of Yahweh worshippers who I want to draw attention to were a community of Hebrew expats who lived along the Nile. They were led by a priestess. And before you comment, no, these weren't outcasts or a small fringe group either. They were a thriving community of Hebrew transplants who worshipped Yahweh, and they were even in regular contact with the main temple in Jerusalem. From what historians have found, there doesn't seem to be any indication of hostility towards them or their Yahweh priestess. And thanks to some pottery shards, we even know her name, Salula. There's a whole interview with one of the archaeologists who's excavating this site, along with some further reading resources I'll link in the description below. It's a really fascinating story. But anyway, we know that some Hebrew diaspora had priestesses as indicated by the Nile community, as well as a few others. And Deborah's story only reinforces this idea that women could be spiritual leaders in some instances in Israelite or Hebrew communities. So then, a natural question emerges. Did the temple in Jerusalem have any at this point? And if they did, what happened to them? Well, it's currently unknown if the main temple in Jerusalem had any priestesses by the time the stories of the judges were assembled together. Remember, the book of Judges was written during the monarchy, but it's talking about a time before the monarchy. The pre-monarchy time during the reign of the judges, it's less clear, but signs do point to Israelite priestesses existing, given the previous examples I just mentioned. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, during the time Jephthah's story happened, Israelite priestesses were possible. But during the time when Jephthah's story was written down and worship of Yahweh was starting to centralize under the monarchy, Israelite priestesses probably weren't possible. Since there was some evidence of women leading Hebrew society in spiritual ways, it is possible, albeit unlikely, that Jephthah's daughter became a priestess. As we've seen, there were other temples aside from the one in Jerusalem that worshipped Yahweh. But as time went on, it seemed that Yahweh worship was centralizing around Jerusalem, and priestesses may have been outlawed, along with just other Yahweh temples entirely. Why was that though? What changed to make priestesses unacceptable? You could say misogyny, and sure, definitely, but I'd argue the whole ancient world was misogynistic. Yet other societies still had priestesses. What changed in the Israelite world to make priestesses unacceptable? One possibility is that Yahweh worshippers in Jerusalem wanted more control over their religion, and to solidify their belief system. One way they went about doing this was centralizing the religion around Jerusalem. If it's all centralized in Jerusalem, they can have greater control since they are in Jerusalem. During the period of centralization, they restricted who could become priests, and where priests could practice the religion. No women could be a priestess, and only men from certain families, aka the line of Aaron from the tribe of Levi, could be priests. And finally, only priests could practice their priesthood in the Jerusalem temple. All other temples had to be closed. From that point on, only a select few were eligible to be priests of Yahweh, and no one could become a priestess of Yahweh. So that was a long-winded way of saying yes, Jephthah could have found a loophole for sacrificing his daughter, and that would be to make her a priestess of Yahweh. I brought all those examples up to show that there is historic precedent for it. Even though Jephthah's story was written down around the time of the monarchy and centralization of the religion, it could have existed as oral tradition further back, and likely did based on some indication we have about the nature of the stories in the Book of Judges. On the other hand of the argument though, we have yes, Jephthah did in fact sacrifice his daughter as a human sacrifice to Yahweh. And for this, we need to look at the greater context of the Book of Judges. If you remember from a few minutes ago, Yahweh did not choose Jephthah directly. Instead, the Israelites found him themselves, and Yahweh only gave his approval of Jephthah when he was about to fight in battle, in the form of a blessing from the Spirit of the Lord. This suggests that Yahweh was becoming more distant with his people. He didn't send them someone personally. He just approved someone they chose themselves. However, it could also suggest the opposite. Yahweh's people were becoming more distant from him. Jephthah's actions to his daughter could show that the average Israelite was so far removed from Yahweh worship, they had forgotten aspects of his worship. For starters, if Jephthah did know what Yahweh was like, then he would know not to sacrifice his daughter as a human sacrifice. There was a time in Israel's early history where humans were sacrificed, but it was eventually forbidden by religious law, and we see multiple points in the Bible repeatedly expressing how forbidden human sacrifice is. Jephthah performing human sacrifice here shows that he really didn't know what his God was supposed to be like, and that's the central point of Judges. The Israelites are continually falling away from Yahweh, and as the book goes on, the Israelites don't even know the God they are supposed to be worshipping. So outside of the greater context of Judges, it looks like Jephthah may have sacrificed his daughter to a life in the priesthood. But within the context of Judges, it looks like she was indeed a human sacrifice. It just makes more sense narratively speaking. So what's the answer? Can we even know what happened to this poor unnamed girl? Well, the yes crowd does have one more point in their favor, and it has to do with specific wording Jephthah used. Jephthah told Yahweh that whatever comes out to greet him after he arrives home from battle, he will sacrifice as a burnt offering. And that's the key factor. If Jephthah had left out the burnt offering part, then the argument could definitely go either way. But because he explicitly mentions the method of sacrifice, there's not much wiggle room. Jephthah most likely did sacrifice his daughter as a burnt offering sacrifice to Yahweh after the battle. It makes sense in the context of Judges, and the fact that he specifically mentions the method doesn't bode well for the no side either. That being said, whether or not Jephthah sacrificed his daughter has been debated for thousands of years. Ancient Jews like the historian Josephus wrote their opinions on the fate of this girl, as well as many rabbis who wrote commentaries of the Talmud, and even early Christians got into debate like St. Augustine. As you can see, there's so much to talk about this girl, and we don't even know her name. Jephthah's daughter was used as a tool to show why you should think carefully about your plans and not make rash decisions. She was the unfortunate victim of her father's rashness, a tragic fate for someone who was a bystander in another person's story. But believe it or not, Jephthah's story doesn't even end there. It would make a perfect tragic note to end on, but there is a short epilogue where Jephthah and the tribe of Ephraim get into a fight. Ephraim is mad that Jephthah did not invite them to the war against the Ammonites, and so they burn down Jephthah's home. Jephthah responds by saying he did invite them to the fight, but they never responded, so Jephthah went on to fight without them anyway, and he still won. Jephthah then challenges Ephraim to a battle, and Jephthah's forces win. Jephthah thought Ephraim should be punished, and his army started hunting down their members. So, as if sacrificing his own daughter wasn't bad enough, Jephthah decided to add genocide to his list of crimes. What a way to end his career as judge. He only lasted 6 years. While many may view Jephthah as rash and cruel, especially towards the end, he did start out seemingly level-headed. I know this was a while ago, but don't forget, he did try to solve the conflict with the Ammonites by diplomacy. They were the ones who attacked first, after all. Jephthah's story seems to embody the phrase, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." He wanted to honor Yahweh and save his people, and Jephthah's daughter paid the ultimate sacrifice for it. And no doubt Jephthah felt horrible for doing so and regretted it the rest of his days. Jephthah's story teaches us many things, both directly, like don't be too rash and it's good to try diplomacy first, and indirectly by making me stay up till absurd hours researching ancient Israelite priestesses. Seriously, check out some of my further reading below. It's really fascinating. I want to thank you all for watching. In the next episode of Judges, we'll play catch up with all the minor judges I skipped over. In the meantime, thank you for watching, leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. I have a Discord where I share memes and updates on various projects, and I also have several methods of supporting me which you can find below. So until next time, have a good one.